Tonight we're going to be looking at the fourth and final installment of this little brief series that we've had on the important questions. So tonight we're going to discover the reason why I'm here. Why am I here? Some of you probably already figured out because I'm not all there, but that's another story. Why am I here? What's my purpose? You know, we're going to look at that because there seems to be some confusion. Years ago, I read an article about a man who had committed suicide, and he compared himself as a peanut in a bin of peanuts at Shea Stadium. In other words, in this whole big world in which he lived, he considers himself just as another one, another person, with nothing, looking forward to nothing, not knowing why he was here or where he was going. And life just wasn't worth it. We're going to talk about that tonight. Why am I here? You know, we talked about what is life. We talked about the brevity of life. We talked about the question, where am I going this morning? And now we're going to be looking at, why am I here? Now, this question actually predicates on another one of the questions, and that question was, where am I from? You see, why I am here is dependent upon where I am from. For example, if I was just an amoeba that floated up off of some scum of water and began to take shape, and over millions of years of evolution, I became like I am, then that's going to mean one thing. That's going to mean that I'm really no different than all the animals out in the jungle. If, however, I was created in the image of God, Genesis 1:27, then that's going to mean something entirely different. Because when He created us, He said, I will make man in our image. That makes me like the eternal Spirit, God. So from being nothing more than an amoeba through evolution, now I become a child of God. Now, the outcome of that is two totally different thoughts and thought patterns. When we think about that, a college professor with a PhD one time was asked, what is man? How many of you have ever had a philosophy class? Okay, we've had a few. Isn't it fun? I mean, you feel like a long-tailed cat in a room full of rocking chairs because you are really outnumbered in your thinking. And these guys are nuts. Just quite simply nuts. When asked about what is man, a college professor said, man is a miserably bleak creature and he dies. That's it. That's what he said. A bleak creature, then he dies. That's it. Think about that. Does that play havoc on your mind? Why are you alive? No wonder people wonder, why am I here? If you buy into the doctrine of Darwinism, you're going to have a lot of chaotic thoughts and probably behavior. And you're going to be confused. Because you're not going to know what is right, what is wrong. Especially when you look at things like Ted Bundy was once told by a philosopher at Harvard University. He said, whatever you do whatever brings you pleasure. Okay? Now, that's existentialism. That's nothing but pure humanism. So now, let me tell you what Bundy said about that. Therefore, I enjoyed raping and murdering. Now, according to this philosopher, what had he done wrong? If we go by the law of the jungle, he was mistreated. If that's the way it is, if we're nothing more than an evolved amoeba, a well-dressed ape, whatever you want to call us, we have no right to tell a person what he should or should not do. This is what the manifesto said. Ethical values are derived from human need and interest as tested by experience. Humanist ground values in human welfare shaped by human circumstances, interests, and concerns. 3 times the word human is used there. That's humanism. 3 times. And the doctrine of humanism is based on human thought, human practice, human experience. That's it. There's nothing eternal. There's nothing that is going to be able to persuade us outside of ourselves how we should live. And as we've said so many times, it's a matter of what I want to do. Now, again, imagine that process when you answer the question, why am I here? Is there any reason to not understand why there is so much chaos morally in our world today with that kind of thinking? Why am I here? Again, and God said, let us make man in our own image according to our likeness. Or my ancestry is just an amoeba. Okay, now, what is the purpose of man's existence? We've already talked about this PhD. What is my purpose? Before I get into that, though, I want to bring up some things about my personal attitude about myself and my life. What makes my thinking different than the world's thinking? Rather than being selfish, I need to be others-centered. Rather than being selfish, I ought to be selfless. How do I know that? Well, I know that simply because of Jesus Christ. And now I want to talk more about that in a little bit. First of all, I've got to love myself. In Matthew 19, verse 19, the answer to the question that Jesus asked, the scribe, in the second command, or the greatest command, he said, you shall love God with all your heart, soul, mind. The second is like unto it, Jesus said. Thou shalt love thy neighbor as thyself. You know, for years, I read through that and studied it and preached on it, and I never really paid attention to that thyself clause. I love my neighbor like I love myself. Okay, now let me apply love to myself. When we talk about the word love, we say it means to do what is best for the other person, correct? Isn't that how we define it? Yes or no? Shake or nod, it doesn't matter. Show me some life, people. All right, now we're getting it. Yes. So here we go. We've got this understanding that loving others, we want to do what's best for them. What about myself? I've got to want the best for myself. Okay, so if I love myself, I want what's best for myself. Now, how am I going to determine what is best for myself? I'll tell you a good place to start. I'll tell you a good place to finish. If you don't know what's best for yourself, dig a little deeper. It's right here. If you want to do what's best for yourself, what does God say is good for you? And that's what's best. So when we talk about self-love, we're talking about treating ourselves with the kind of love that God has for us. And treating ourselves with the kind of love that we need for ourselves. Self-love. Once we can conquer that and we understand what's really good for us, my friends, that is a game changer in our lives. The second one, now I notice I put good esteem. I think it's interesting, back when I had psychology, back in the good old days, whenever things like homosexuality was considered abnormal, in those days, they did a study, I believe it was Ohio State, did a study on prisoners. They were wanting to decide about their self-esteem. They went into the study thinking that these prisoners would have a low self-esteem. You know what they found out? It was just the opposite. They were proud of what they could do. The majority of them felt good about their abilities. They didn't have a low self-esteem. They had a good self-esteem. Folks, we don't need a good self-esteem. I remember being on that bandwagon several years ago until I realized something. It's not that we have good self-esteem. We should have God esteem. Where does your esteem come from? You know, good self-esteem comes from physical areas. Someone that's really good looking, we could say, well, they have self-esteem. I can't say that, so negate that one right there. The second one, if someone is rich, famous, they have a great self-esteem. Negate that one. I'm out of the loop on that one, and by the way, most of you are too. The third one, if you're popular, if everybody loves you, you can have a great self-esteem. Well, once again, there's going to be those that's not going to care much for us because of who we are. So you see, good self-esteem is based on things a lot of times we cannot attain because of what we are and who we are. It's not about a good self-esteem, it's about a God esteem. Our esteem must come from God. Let God build us up. God's already told us what He wanted from us. You know, there's an interesting story in Genesis 11. And it kind of goes along with what we're talking about. In Genesis 11, man had gotten to the place where they wanted to build a big tower to make a name for themselves. You see, people will do a lot of things to make a name for themselves, won't they? So they begin to build this tower. But the interesting thing to me is what God said about these people. Because they were of one mind, God says, I've got to intervene lest they accomplish that task. Boy, I've preached this in a sermon here. It's been a while back. But I want you to think about that. Just a reminder. I want you to think about that. They were going to accomplish that if God had intervened and confusing their language. Why were they going to accomplish it? Because they were of one mind. But you know what that one mind was? That one mind was to make a name for themselves, to feel good about themselves, to feel good about their accomplishments, to say, look here, what we did. That didn't come from God. So God intervened. If there's any one thing we can read when we read the Bible, it's going to be this. If our esteem comes from ourselves, or from other people, or other things, or other events in our life, we're going to be sadly disappointed. We share the stage. We're not in this alone. Just today, I heard a Philadelphia Eagle running back, when asked about his 176-yard day he'd had, asked if he thought that that was a good thing because the team that he scored that or run that against was a team that passed him by in the draft, okay? So, basically, did it feel good to get your vengeance? You know what he said? It wasn't about that at all. And he said, I couldn't have done that without those big linemen up front. We're not going to get anywhere by ourselves. For God so loved the world, He gave His only begotten Son. I want to add an addendum to that. For God so loved the world, He gave it the church. The church. You're not going to read it in those many words, but you're going to read it throughout that book. I'm telling you, our church helps define who we are. And the church helps us to maintain the kind of direction that we need to go, like I talked about this morning. We share the stage. The word together in the New Testament is used 129 times. Think about that, together. 129 times. The next point I want to make is, in this life we need confidence. But not confidence based on ourselves. Again, confidence based on self is going to be short-lived. In Romans 8:28, for all things work out together for the good, for those who love the Lord. We need to understand something. And in the Lord, things work out. But I want you to recognize the context. He's talking about spiritual things, and let me tell you what he's talking about. If you look at verse 18, he's talking about persecutions. He says, basically, if I can put it in my own words, persecutions in this earth is short-lived. They come and they go. But the love of God is forever. Okay, we don't understand that because we're not persecuted. At least not in that sense. We're persecuted, all right. But our persecutions really aren't that much compared with what they were going through. But even at that, the persecutions that we go through do cause us some stress and some problems and some heartache at times. But understand, whatever we go through on this earth is nothing compared to the love of God. When I understand that I am a child of God, created by God, and I understand that God loves me that much, there is nothing on this earth that can happen that can take that love from me. Now, I can walk away, turn my back on him. I can do that. I know many who have. But as long as I'm loving him, he'll always love me. And that's what he wants. All things work together for good to those who love the Lord. This persecution, as Paul's saying, if you love the Lord, they'll pass. And like I said this morning, it'll minimize the pain and the suffering knowing where we're headed. You see, all these questions kind of tie together, don't they? What is life? It's a life of service, serving God. It's a life where we know where we're from. We're from God. Therefore, if we're from God, we know where we're going. We want to go to heaven. And if we want to go to heaven, all of a sudden now we realize why I am here. Next point I want to look at. We are each unique. I am fascinated by the fact that my fingerprints are different than yours. I couldn't tell you how many people there are on this earth. I don't know how many fingerprints are in this room, but there are no two fingerprints that match. None. We are all unique, different. God made us that way. Why am I here? I am here to celebrate that difference, that uniqueness, that person that God made, that made me different than anyone else. I don't have to be like the pretty ones. I don't have to be like the rich ones. I don't have to be like the popular ones. I can be myself because that's the way God made me. When you think about that, it takes a lot of load off of our hearts, doesn't it? You know, Peter said of the church, when we're all together, we are peculiar people. And he didn't mean that as an insult, folks. He meant it as a compliment. Because we're different. Just like the fingertips. We're different. All of us are different. The next thing I want to look at is our purpose. Why are we here? Isn't that what we want to know? There's some worldly purposes that really a lot of people have adapted to. And I'm not going to I just want to mention a couple. Some it's to make money. And that's their goal in life, their single goal. They would sacrifice anything and everything. They would sacrifice their families and they would sacrifice their eternal home to make money. And they'd even sacrifice their mental and physical health. There are people who will sacrifice anything to have fun, to recreate, to drink it up, to smoke it up. All in the name of fun. Stay out on the lake, especially on Sundays. We have those people who give their life over, sacrifice their life, basically, to the kind of things that will destroy them. Now, I want us to look at the purpose God has for us. Okay, I go back, where am I from? If God created me, and He did, and if I'm His child, and if I'm baptized in Jesus Christ, I am, then He has a purpose for me. And I've got to understand that purpose. Okay, first of all, it's to love and to obey Him. To love and obey Christ. In Deuteronomy 10, verse 12. And now, Israel, What does the Lord your God require of you, but to fear the Lord your God, to walk in all his ways, to love him, to serve the Lord your God with all your heart, all your soul, all your mind, and to keep the commandments of the Lord and his statutes, which I command you today. Are you ready for this? Hang on. Hang on. For your good. Why we obey God and serve him and keep his commandments? For our good. Did you know that was part of that? Our purpose is to be holy. Rick talked about that this morning. We serve a holy God. Therefore, if we're going to be like God, we got to be holy, don't we, Rick? You got to be holy. He discussed what holiness is. So I'm not going to spend that much time with it. Don't have to. Rick already did. Holiness. Be ye holy. 1 Peter 1 verse 16, as it is written, be ye holy as I am holy. You know, 4 times in the book of Leviticus, especially chapter 11, chapter 19, chapter 20, it tells Israel to be holy as God is holy. Now, if Israel's told that, isn't it much more important as Christians that we follow that same suggestion, or command by Peter? Be holy. That's not a suggestion. You know, when my mom and daddy used to tell me to be good, that wasn't a suggestion. That was a command. And if I was anything but good, then I had things happen that I didn't like. These are not suggestions. This is a command. Be holy as I am holy. Share the gospel. Let's share the gospel. That's one of the reasons why I'm here. Okay, I am a citizen of the United States of America. We all want to be good citizens, don't we? Well, how about being citizens of the kingdom of heaven? What is it that is required of citizens of the kingdom of heaven? One of the things is to share the gospel. For I'm not ashamed of the gospel of Jesus Christ, for it is the power of God and salvation to all who believe, the Jew first and also to the Greeks. You know, we can talk about football, we can talk about basketball, we can talk about track, we can talk about all these sports. We can talk about hunting, we can talk about fishing. I use all these things because that's what I'm familiar with and I like to talk about. Ladies, you have your things you talk about. I have no idea what that is. How much time do we spend talking about the gospel? I heard a preacher say one time, we talk about everything under the sun except the sun. Unfortunately, that may be true. We share the gospel. We don't want to go to heaven by ourselves. If you want to go to heaven by yourself, I think you need to rethink that position. Jesus taught us what service is. John 13. We are to be servants. If this is what your master can do, which was washing feet, if this is what your master does, then what should you do? If Jesus finds himself as a servant, in a servant's capacity of washing feet and wiping them off, then who are we to think we don't have to stoop so low as that to be a servant? Once again, I asked a bunch of the nurses, and even the chaplain at the hospital when I was in there, of what their purpose was on this earth. Do you know not one said to serve God? Now, I understand they're not all Christians, but not one of them. In fact, they all said to help other people, which that's commendable. But Christians, I help other people because I'm a servant of God. You know, I would have thought that would have been number one. Especially if any of them would remember. And like I said, I don't know for sure that they were. I don't believe they were. The ones I talked to asked exactly where they went, they weren't. But my point is this. We don't think about the service part. Serving God. Being a servant. Now, what they need to understand is how good of a service they provide. But it needs to be provided for the glory of God. Do you consider yourself as a good servant? Will the Lord be pleased with the service that we render? We need to shine as lights. Sometimes our lights can get a little dim. Philippians 2, verse 15, starting up at verse 14, do all things without complaining or disputing, that you may become blameless, harmless, children of God without fault in the midst of a crooked and perverse generation, among whom you shine as lights in the world, holding fast the word of life, so that I may rejoice in the day of Christ, that I have not run in vain or labored in vain. Right in this hand, this left hand, is the flashlight into eternity. The flashlight into eternity. From it, we see the lofty heights of heaven. And we guide people through this book. This book radiates through us. Or it should. We should be like beacons in those towers in the water to show sailors where home is. Lastly, we represent Christ as ambassadors. 2 Corinthians 5, verse 20, now then, we are ambassadors for Christ, as though God were pleading through us. We implore you on Christ's behalf, be reconciled to God. I know we've all read that passage, but have you really read it? I want you to see what Paul says. We are ambassadors for Christ, as though God was pleading through us. We represent God's word, God's message, as though God were pleading to us. We implore you on Christ's behalf. By the way, 1 Corinthians wasn't written to preachers. It wasn't written to a preacher's meeting. It was written to Christians. So what he's talking about, yeah, it fits the preachers, but it also fits each and every Christian. We are all ambassadors of Christ. We represent Christ. Ephesians 6, verse 20, he said, for which I am ambassador in chains, that in it I may speak boldly. He was an ambassador. Even though in chains, he said, I still speak boldly. Tonight, I encourage you to discover God's purpose for you. God has a purpose for you, every one of you. Every one of us. He has a purpose for us. Discover that purpose. Live for that purpose. There's so many parables that really teach that. And one thing that in all these parables we learn is if we don't carry out the purpose that God has given to us, well, we just need to carry that out because we're not going to like the outcome. What's your purpose? Are you self-centered, self-seeking, narcissistic? Or is your purpose surrounded with the purpose of God? If you have a reason to come tonight, we encourage you to do so while we stand and we sing.